Hello! So, didn't take a shower today, and I think this cool hat helps with noticing what I'm learning, because it makes you pay more attention, maybe? I don't know. And I didn't wash my hair. Did I say that? Because I don't work today. So, I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to record myself doing private speech, because apparently private speech is what we do when we feel challenged, and I feel challenged by all this information. And it's other regulated because I'm using my notes, which I won't be able to do on the exam, which is going to be totally self-regulated. So here we go. Terms. L1, your mother language, learned from birth. That's easy. L2, second language, or target language, or any additional language that you're learning. Pretty easy, but these terms can become confusing when you're dealing with people who have learned more than one language from a young age, when you're dealing with early bilinguals. Okay, how about EFL and ESL? EFL is like me in China teaching English. ESL is like you in America teaching English. Easy enough? Declarative knowledge, that's what you know about the language. Procedural knowledge is what you know how to do in the language. Study abroad, remember our friends Stephen and Julia. Stephen, who made the most of his experience, Julia, who did not. That's when you're taking part in an instructional setting in the country or place of the target language. But of course, it depends on your participation and involvement, your integrative motivation. How much do you want to be a part of that culture where you are and integrate into it? May not have as good of results if you're already advanced, apparently. Good news, it can be recreated with the right type and intensity of instruction in an EFL context. So that's good news for people who don't have the chance to go abroad. They can recreate it in their own country. And your personal views play a strong effect. And it's recommended that there should be pre-study abroad preparation. Yep, I agree. I was involved in that for Chinese students going to America. Interlanguage, that's the developing language as you're learning in L2. It's systematic. It has its own regularities and patterns as the language is evolving and developing and as one is learning. Intralingual are errors that are not related to interference of L1, but rather general learning processes and pathways, like overgeneralization, for instance. L1s do this when they learn English, just like L2s learning English, with the adding ed to irregular past tense or making a question with do to form a question when it's not necessary. Markedness. This gets me a little dyslexic, but here we go. Has to do with the naturalness, the frequency across languages. Okay, so marked is when something is less frequent, whereas unmarked is when something is more frequent. And the marked members presuppose that there are less marked members or unmarked members. All right, so if it's existing in some languages, like the voiced B, it's considered marked. If it's existing in all languages, like the voiceless P, it's considered less marked. It's kind of confusing, right? The less marked one is more common. Am I saying that right? Yeah, the dyslexia is killing me. Okay. So unmarked or more natural is acquired before the marked or less natural, less common. Anyways, I will have to slow way down and think about that when it comes up, because I get things like that mixed up very easily. Okay, so we have these language universals and individual differences. I found this information on Ortega, page 9, and I think that's what we're getting into. So universals are going to affect everyone. Maybe that's what it means, like age, mother tongue, environment, and cognition, whereas individual differences are going to vary by person, like aptitude, motivation, personality, and learning styles. Maybe? Okay. Carrying right along. Sub areas. We took the linguistics course. We went into these, but just to review: phonology, sound system; morphology, adding those prefixes and suffixes; syntax, how words are put together to make phrases and sentences; semantics, what does the word mean; pragmatics, how we use the language; and don't forget lexicon. I messed this one up at the beginning. I put it under semantics, but I guess it's its own thing called for vocabulary. And orthography is the writing system, but we didn't get into that much. Moving right along. The major approaches. I organized these this way because of the screencast so kindly provided by our professor. You have 5 major approaches, or categories of approaches. Okay, so this structural behaviorist idea, this is very focused on habits. So you're going to have lots of repetition and the contrastive analysis hypothesis, the idea of hierarchy of difficulty. Apparently you don't want to have any mistakes because you're forming habits. So you're just practicing doing the right thing a lot. Hey, there's a place for it, especially in learning to pronounce words. But I think there also is a place for it in learning the rhythm of language and some other aspects. Nativist or innatist, they have this idea of universal grammar. The focus is on the competence, not the production, what you know. No social focus. Input, hear and see a lot of the language, and this moved into ideally language that you can comprehend so that you can figure out the meaning. Effect filter hypothesis. Not sure, gotta look that up. Natural order hypothesis leads to the natural approach. So you teach like the L1 was learned when you're teaching the L2. Maybe age is a factor there. Cognitive, information processing. The mind is like a computer. So you have all these, I remember making up a mind map of this when we were studying it. Okay, so automatic versus controlled knowledge. Declarative, what you can explain. Procedural, what you can do. Explicit, what you're told. Implicit, what you pick up. I guess there's a big question of like, how can we create situations where language is picked up? How can we get the language to automatize? Yeah, and become more automatic instead of something we're still controlling. Am I talking about that right? And the interlanguage was mentioned here. So of course, in this situation, you're doing a lot of processing, but you still don't see the other person. Now, here we are, we're mixing the idea of the other person and interacting with cognitive, also known as emergentism and usage-based. We don't just want to be receiving that information. We want to be using it. And this is where noticing comes in. I wore my hat. I mean, I know I'm stretching the idea of it, but when we notice the language, when we focus on it, we're going to pick it up. And focuses on the learner and what they can notice in interaction. And then we have socioculture. It's my favorite, I guess because I'm social, which is why online classes are hard. Vygotsky, the zone of proximal development, scaffolding, communicative language teaching. Not totally sure why these two can't just go together, because, you know, socioculture is written here, so can't you just like put this stuff together and include both? But anyways, this is where we did all the private speech, inner speech, etc., and the importance of the context and the culture that you're in when you're learning the language socially. Speech versus written language performance. I felt like the information of this was kind of spread out all over the place, so I had trouble knowing what I should be focusing on. But I would say that speech involves less time to process, so it's more it represents more what the individual has proceduralized, while written performance can take more time and allow for more thinking, so it may be more indicative of our declarative knowledge and what is still being automatized. I use this idea in class. I often let my students write their answers first before going and speaking about them, so that they can kind of have time to process before they're talking. I've actually used a lot of things that we've done in this class in my classes. Okay, error analysis that's based on the L1 and its problems. So errors are good. They inform us where a point of misunderstanding is and help us understand the learner's competence. They're evidence of the process of learning, so that structuralist behavior is not wanting to have any mistakes doesn't allow for this. But you have to remember, sometimes errors are avoided. That's very common here in Chinese culture. It's better to just not talk than to talk and be wrong. So they do a lot of avoiding. And it's important to make sure we're not assuming that interlingual, is it called interlingual interference? Yeah, that first language transfer is not happening, but things could be intralingual, as we mentioned before, because of the markedness of languages. So when languages have things that are less common in languages, they're considered marked and more difficult. And the L1 may struggle just as much as the L2 with those concepts. Sources of influence on interlanguage beyond the L1. So there was one section in Ortega that was called Beyond the L1. So I don't know if that's what we're supposed to be looking at. But hey, if you've already learned 2 languages, it'll accelerate your learning of another language. I think that totally makes sense. I think it also relates to knowing your own language well. I think also helps you to learn another language, because you just understand how language works. So if you're a linguist, you've learned a lot about how languages work, and then the learning of languages perhaps is more productive and effective. Interlanguage processes. Interlanguage. See, not interlanguage. Oh, the interlanguage. That's the language you're developing. Okay? So what are some processes that help happen during that? One process might be simplification. He won't eat cookie. So drop the S, don't put in the to, don't put in the article. Yeah. Overgeneralization. When you overuse something, you learn a rule, that's great, but then you use it where you're not supposed to use it. Mentioned some of those before. He go to the store